Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening the file on a case that is far more than just a tragedy. It's really a foundational event in the history of forensic science itself. We're stepping back to the spring of 1948 to the northern industrial town of Blackburn in Lancashire.
Yeah, and this deep dive centers on the murder of June Anne Devaney, who was almost 4 years old. The crime itself was, well, horrifyingly brutal. There's no other word for it. But its lasting importance really lies in the immediate and frankly revolutionary response it triggered from the police. This single case became a critical landmark moment. It was the first successful mass fingerprinting operation in the United Kingdom, and it really changed how major crimes would be investigated from then on.
Exactly. And you have to picture the scene. Queen's Park Hospital. It's a large institution. June Anne was actually there recovering from a fairly mild bout of pneumonia. She was due to go home, back to her family, that very morning, May 15th, 1948. But instead, the discovery that her cot was empty just plunged the whole community into this terrible crisis. So we're going to unpack not just the awful facts of the crime, but also the extraordinary logistical and ethical campaign that DCI John Capstick and his team launched to solve it.
And that's the core of our mission today, really. To understand that tightrope walk they had to perform, they needed to innovate using this massive scale data collection. I mean, an unprecedented invasion of privacy for the time, you have to remember. But at the same time, they had to guarantee to the public that this data would be respected, handled carefully, and crucially destroyed afterwards. You know, in post-war Britain, public skepticism towards state authority was, well, it was already quite high. So balancing that innovation with maintaining public trust was absolutely key to getting justice in this case.
Okay, so let's start inside the hospital walls on that fateful night. It's the very early hours of Saturday, May 15th, 1948. June Anne is asleep in Ward CH3. The nurse on duty, Gwendolyn Humphreys, she was in the ward kitchen nearby doing some admin, getting ready for the shift change.
Right. And Humphreys had checked the ward repeatedly through the night. Her account is very precise. She specifically noted June Anne sound asleep in her cot at around 12:30 a.m. That's the last time anyone saw the child alive and, unharmed in the ward. The hospital environment would have been quiet then. The war was over, but life was still pretty austere, governed by routine. A hospital ward, that was supposed to be the safest place imaginable, wasn't it?
Absolutely. But that routine was just shattered at 1:20 a.m. Nurse Humphreys felt a sudden draft, like a cold breeze coming down the corridor. When she went to investigate, she saw the porch door at the end of the children's ward was standing open. She closed it. But then, as she scanned the cots, well, that's when the terror must have set in.
June Anne's cot was empty. And the critical detail, the thing that immediately told them this wasn't a child wandering off, the drop side of the cot was still securely up, in place. So she hadn't climbed out. She'd been lifted out by an adult. It was clearly an abduction right from the start.
And the physical evidence started right there, immediately, on the ward floor itself. The hospital floors were highly waxed, very common in institutions back then, and this polished surface provided an immediate and pretty ominous canvas. Humphreys noticed a clear trail of adult footprints.
And what made them truly ominous, as you say, was the type of print. They weren't from boots or shoes with hard soles. No, they were made by stockinged feet. That told the investigators, when they arrived later, that the perpetrator had deliberately come in, paused, and taken off his shoes. It was a calculated move, wasn't it? To ensure silence while he prowled around the ward. This wasn't a panicked, impulsive thing. It's just a deliberate selection and removal.
The staff searched frantically for about half an hour before calling the police. They arrived just before 2 a.m. Detective Chief Inspector John Capstick took charge, and he quickly realized the unique nature of this stockinged footprint evidence, calling in expert help straight away.
The search then quickly widened out from inside the hospital to the extensive grounds outside. It was only about an hour and a half later, at 3:17 a.m., that the body was discovered. June Anne was found lying face down in the grass. It was about 300 feet from the ward, right next to this imposing 8-foot-high sandstone boundary wall.
Yeah, the sources really convey the absolute shock of that discovery. The site was described as horrific. Extensive blood stains in the grass, her nightdress was torn and pulled up, just clear signs of extreme violence. Capstick immediately contacted Scotland Yard. He knew this needed the highest level of forensic and investigative expertise available anywhere in the country.
And the postmortem confirmed their worst fears. It also provided the terrifying details needed to start profiling how the attack happened. June Anne died of shock, which resulted from extensive internal injuries and multiple skull fractures. The internal injuries were also consistent with her having been raped.
But it's the way the skull fractures occurred. That's what truly defines the sheer brutality of the act. The pathologist determined these weren't from a fall or, a single blow. They were caused by the child being repeatedly swung. The analysis suggested at least 4 separate, very forceful impacts into that hard sandstone boundary wall. All while the attacker held her by her legs or ankles, he effectively used the wall itself as the weapon.
And we should probably detail the smaller injuries, too, because they speak to the struggle and the control the attacker used. They noted clear bruises on her upper inner thighs and neck before death, consistent with pressure from a thumb and forefinger. There were also puncture wounds, likely from fingernails, on one ankle, and numerous teeth marks on her left buttock. I mean, every piece of evidence indicated this sustained, savage attack before the moment of death.
Capstick's reaction is often mentioned in the accounts of the case. He apparently confessed the sight was so horrific it haunted him. He said he saw the scene through a mist of tears, despite being a long-serving detective. But that emotional reaction, it wasn't weakness, was it? It seems like it was an immediate, fierce commitment. He apparently swore right there and then that he'd bring the murderer to justice. And that commitment really fueled the innovative thinking that came next.
Yeah, that personal, emotional investment was critical. It gave him the drive he needed to seek these extraordinary measures. The initial thinking, based on the crime scene, the location, it suggested they were looking for someone local. And then there was a taxi driver, Bernard Reagan, who reported picking up a man with a local accent near the hospital that night. That kind of solidified the initial belief that the perpetrator was either from Blackburn or knew the area very, very well. They were hunting a ghost, really, but one within their own community.
Okay, so now let's shift our focus away from the immediate horror of the discovery and onto the silent, objective facts left behind, specifically inside the hospital ward. And the most critical item was found right beside June Anne's empty cot, the Winchester bottle.
This small, seemingly insignificant object, it was destined to become the key witness in the whole case. It was just a standard glass 1946 Winchester bottle, partially filled with sterile water. But the reason it was so significant was that Nurse Humphreys was absolutely certain it had been on a trolley at the far end of the ward when she last checked. Someone, the abductor, had moved it, picked it up, carried it over, and placed it right there beside the cot.
And the very act of moving it gave the police an insight, didn't it, into the intruder's mindset. The thinking was the bottle was likely picked up as a potential weapon. The killer, Peter Griffiths, he later confessed that he intended to use it if he was challenged by any hospital staff.
And of course, the surface of that bottle, smooth glass, was a perfect surface for retaining latent fingerprints. But before the police could really focus on the killer's prints, they had this enormous task. They had to eliminate every single person who had legitimate access to that ward. This is where the sheer manual administrative workload really began. It was huge.
Yeah, this elimination process was just exhaustive. They started broad, checking over 2,000 individuals who had general access to the hospital complex. Then they narrowed it down 642 people who had specific regular access to Ward CH3 itself, so nurses, doctors, maintenance workers, cleaners, that sort of thing.
But they didn't even stop there. Capstick's team understood they had to be incredibly comprehensive, cover every possible angle, so they launched this, unprecedented effort to trace and fingerprint anyone who'd had legitimate access to that specific ward in the 5 years prior to the murder.
I mean, just think about that undertaking in 1948. No computers, no databases. They tracked down ambulance drivers, tradesmen who'd done repairs years before, even nurses' boyfriends who might have visited, relatives working elsewhere in the hospital who might have passed through. Just an enormous, incredibly complex web of contacts, all traced manually using paper records and face-to-face interviews.
And the result of this absolutely gargantuan initial effort, a complete dead end, every single one of those individuals was eliminated. Their prints didn't match, which left just one set of prints remaining on the bottle. One set that was well-defined, clear, unbroken, and completely unknown to the Police Fingerprint Bureau.
And what's fascinating, too, is the analysis they did on the quality of the prints themselves. The head of the Lancashire Fingerprint Bureau noted that the nature of the ridge detail, very clear, well-defined, without the usual scarring or flattening or calluses, you might see it strongly suggested the prints belonged to a young man, someone they thought with very little experience of hard manual labor. That was a crucial piece of early profiling, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And the fact that these prints weren't already in the police files meant the killer almost certainly had no prior convictions. He was likely a first-time offender, at least for anything serious enough to be fingerprinted for. So the investigators knew with certainty they had the killer's fingerprints right there on that bottle, but they had no name to attach to them. And this is what forced DCI Capstick to make the most radical decision of his entire career. If the killer's print wasn't in their records, well, they would have to bring the records to the print.
Right, and this is the moment the case really transcends true crime and becomes a landmark in forensic history. Capstick proposed fingerprinting every single male aged 16 and over living in or immediately around Blackburn, a town, remember, of about 123,000 people at the time. This was just a massive ask of the public, demanding participation, biometric data from tens of thousands of citizens who weren't actually under any suspicion at all.
The sheer scale of it is hard to grasp today, even now when we're sort of accustomed to digital surveillance and data collection. Back in 1948, this was a breathtaking logistical challenge, but also a huge ethical one. It was a complete departure from traditional policing methods, which relied on finding suspects or witnesses first. This was blanket data collection, a massive, albeit temporary, invasion of privacy.
So the crucial question then becomes, how did Capstick get authorization for this? And maybe more importantly, how did he get the public to comply? This is where the ethical framework they set up was just, well, administrative genius, really.
Yeah, the police understood that for this operation to have any chance of success, it needed absolute transparency and, crucially, trust. So the promise they made to the public was revolutionary for the time. They stated very clearly that all the fingerprint records obtained, all 46,000 plus of them, would not be used for any other cases, current or future. And, critically, the entire set of records would be publicly destroyed once this specific case was closed.
Let's just pause on that promise for a second. In that post-war climate, British citizens were used to a degree of state-controlled rationing, ID cards. The memory of wartime surveillance was fresh. There was a genuine anxiety about unchecked state power. So, by promising to destroy the records, the police were effectively saying, look, we're prioritizing getting justice for this child right now over building some permanent national fingerprint database for the future.
And that promise worked. It absolutely worked. The level of public outrage over the murder was so intense, and the police's commitment to privacy seemed so genuine and clear that cooperation was almost universal. The sources say that refusal was incredibly rare, and when it did happen, maybe someone was hesitant. A senior officer would go and visit them personally, reiterate the solemn promise about destruction, and apparently, without fail, the citizen would then consent to being printed. That willingness of tens of thousands of people to submit their biometric data based entirely on trust in that promise, that's a monumental achievement in policing history, isn't it?
It really is. Now let's talk about the logistics. How do they actually do it? The operation kicked off just 8 days after the murder, on May 23rd. The scale required its own specialized unit. Inspector William Barton led a dedicated task force of 20 officers who were trained specifically for this high-volume manual process.
They started by using the electoral register, the official list of who was eligible to vote. That gave them a framework to organize their house-to-house inquiries. But they couldn't just take full sets of 10 fingerprints from everyone. That would have been physically impossible to process efficiently. It's just too slow given the urgency. They needed speed and relevance.
So the team designed what they called a special card. And this card was highly customized. It was designed to capture only the evidence that mattered for this case. Since the prints on the Winchester bottle were identified as coming from the killer's left hand, specifically the forefinger, middle finger, ring finger, and a section of the left palm, the card was set up to record only those 4 specific areas. That dramatically sped up the collection process in each house.
Exactly. But the card was more than just a space for prints. It was actually a pretty comprehensive administrative tool for 1948. It collected the individual's name, their address, and very importantly, their national identity registration number. And furthermore, the officers taking the prints also recorded the individual's stated movements during the critical hours, roughly 11 p.m. on May 14th to 2 a.m. on May 15th. This allowed them to immediately cross-reference potential alibis or locations if they got a fingerprint match later on.
I mean, just consider the clerical nightmare this represented. 20 officers out collecting this data every day. Thousands upon thousands of these special cards pouring back into the Fingerprint Bureau. And there, other specialized staff had to manually sort them, log them, and most importantly, compare them one by one against the single set of latent prints from that bottle.
Imagine the scene in that bureau. This wasn't AI doing lightning-fast comparisons, no. It was analysts, probably using magnifying glasses, looking at stacks and stacks of these index cards, checking just those 4 specific ridge patterns on one card against the enlarged photograph of the latent print from the bottle. One comparison at a time, repeated over 40,000 times. The sheer concentration required day after day, and the risk of human error over that many comparisons. It's astronomical when you think about it.
And this initial phase, covering everyone they could find on the electoral register, it lasted for 2 grueling months. By late July 1948, the task force had collected over 40,000 sets of prints. They'd visited over 35,000 homes. And still, no match. Nothing. This must have been an incredibly frustrating moment. It required DCI Capstick to pivot his strategy again.
He realized they potentially had a blind spot. The electoral register, reliable as it usually was likely out of date in some respects. Remember, World War II had only ended 3 years earlier. There were thousands of men, specifically ex-servicemen, who'd recently been discharged or maybe relocated for work or just returned home, who weren't yet registered to vote at their current address. They were exactly the demographic most likely to be mobile and potentially missed by the initial sweep based on the register.
So the investigation shifted focus, and this required another clever, if low-tech, administrative workaround. They decided to target national registration numbers. Everyone in Britain at that time had one of these numbers, and crucially, it was printed on their ration book, which absolutely everyone needed for buying food and essential supplies in austere post-war Britain.
So they worked directly with the local food office. They painstakingly cross-referenced names and addresses from the food office records against the list of people already fingerprinted via the electoral register drive. They manually identified over 200 men who had current ration books registered in the Blackburn area, but whose names hadn't appeared on the electoral list or the list of those already printed. This was the final, kind of desperate sweep, carried out entirely manually by comparing names, addresses, and numbers across these different paper-based lists. And one of those 200 names identified in this final phase was Peter Griffiths.
And the breakthrough finally arrived on August 11th, nearly 3 months after the murder. Officers visited Peter Griffiths. He was 22 years old, an ex-serviceman, working as a packer on the night shift at a local flour mill. And he lived just a few streets away from Queen's Park Hospital.
Yeah, Griffiths fit the profile perfectly, didn't he? Young, likely not on the electoral register yet because he was recently discharged, and his hands probably matched that earlier profiling, hands that hadn't yet been hardened by decades of heavy manual labor. He complied instantly when the officers called, provided his prints on the special card without any fuss. Ironically, it turned out his niece had recently been an inpatient at Queen's Park Hospital herself, which gave him a seemingly innocent reason to cooperate fully with the police inquiry.
So the next day, August 12th, that was the defining moment for this whole massive operation. Fingerprint expert Colin Campbell was doing the comparisons back at the Bureau. By this point, the task force had officially collected and processed 46,253 sets of prints. Campbell was nearing the very end of the pile, maybe fewer than 200 cards left to check.
And the sources describe the drama of that moment perfectly. Campbell made the match. He found the perfect comparison between Griffith's prints and the latent prints from the bottle. Those specific ridge characteristics in the 4 requested areas lined up exactly. According to the accounts, he literally jumped out of his chair and shouted, "I've got him! It's here!"
That single cry must have just validated the extraordinary, painstaking effort of the previous 3 months for everyone involved.
The police then moved with swift, silent precision. DCI Capstick himself arrested Peter Griffiths later that same evening as Griffiths was leaving his home to go to his night shift at the mill. Apparently, Griffiths initially denied any involvement during the car ride to the station and in the first phases of the interrogation. But the police strategy was never really based on getting a confession first. It was always based on the power of that incontrovertible scientific evidence, the fingerprint. So when DCI Capstick laid the enlarged photographs of the latent print from the Winchester bottle right alongside the freshly inked print taken from Griffiths just the day before, the denial just crumbled instantly. Griffiths looked at the evidence, the clear match, and stated that defining line of the case. "Well, if they are my fingerprints on the bottle, I'll tell you all about it."
Griffiths then tried to construct this narrative of, profound drunkenness, presumably to try and mitigate his responsibility. He claimed he spent the evening drinking alone, consuming, frankly, an enormous amount of alcohol. 11 pints of bitter, 2 double shots of rum, and then a pint of Guinness on top of that. He claimed he'd just wandered towards the hospital grounds intending to sober up and was in a severe state of intoxication when he somehow ended up inside the ward.
But, as we mentioned earlier, this narrative immediately clashed with the testimony from that taxi driver, Bernard Reagan. Reagan had already told police he'd picked up a man matching Griffiths' description much earlier that night and had specifically dropped him off near the quarry, which was right next to Queen's Park Hospital. That suggested a much more deliberate act, didn't it? Perhaps even a planned destination near the hospital grounds, rather than just a random drunken stumble that happened to end up inside the children's ward.
In his confession, Griffiths did reveal his familiarity with the hospital layout. He'd actually been an inpatient there himself as a child, apparently in that very same wing. He described entering through an unlocked door, taking off his shoes, confirming the police's early analysis of the stocking footprints, and picking up that Winchester bottle.
He detailed prowling along the cots before selecting June Anne. And the most harrowing part of his testimony, the detail that has really stuck with historians and writers about this case, was his description of carrying the child out of the hospital. He said she trustingly placed her arms around his neck. He then claimed he killed her outside in a sudden fit of rage when she started crying in the grounds. While he apparently refused to go into specific detail about the sexual assault aspect, the basic narrative of abduction and murder was established through his words.
Despite that confession, Griffiths quickly seemed to retreat into himself, refusing any further cooperation. He wouldn't provide blood samples or pubic hair samples for additional forensic comparison. But by then, the investigators were already miles ahead, weren't they? They were gathering robust physical evidence for absolutely irrefutable corroboration.
Exactly. And this is where we see the power of contemporary forensic science, even back in 1948. The investigators weren't just satisfied with the confession and the fingerprints alone, they needed more. They managed to locate a pawn ticket dated May 31st, so just a couple of weeks after the murder, for a suit belonging to Griffiths. They recovered that suit from the local pawnbroker.
And forensics immediately went to work on it. The laboratory found bloodstains on several parts of the jacket and also on the trousers. The blood was analyzed and confirmed to be type A, which matched June Anne Devaney's blood type. Now, type A is relatively common, but finding it specifically on the confessed attacker's clothing was another critical link in the chain.
But even more definitively, they performed textile analysis, which was still a developing science back then, but powerful nonetheless. Fibers collected from Griffiths' pawn suit were microscopically compared to fibers that had been found on June Anne's clothing, on her body, and even minute fibers found on the window ledge where the killer was thought to have entered. And the match was perfect. This wasn't just a general resemblance. The fiber structure, the type of dye used, the age characteristics, they were described as identical.
And finally, they circled back to those stocking feet, the very first clue. Griffiths' home was searched, and the police found a pair of his socks, distinctively red and blue. Fibers from these specific socks were carefully extracted and analyzed, and they perfectly matched the fibers that had been recovered from those stocking footprints left on the highly waxed floor of Ward CH3 3 months earlier. So the investigators had created this absolutely unbreakable forensic chain. Yeah, the fingerprints, the confession, the blood evidence, the textile fibers from the suit, and the textile fibers from the socks, all pointing squarely, irrefutably at Peter Griffiths.
Yeah, the combination of all these different strands of evidence was just overwhelming. Griffiths' final recorded statement before he was formally charged really reflected his realization of this insurmountable evidence. He said, "I'm sorry for both parents' sake, and I hope I get what I deserve."
The trial of Peter Griffiths for the murder of June Anne Devaney began on October 15, 1948. It was held before Mr. Justice Oliver at the Assize Court in Lancaster. Now, since Griffiths had already confessed, the defense strategy immediately pivoted. It centered entirely on trying to avoid the death sentence by pleading not guilty by reason of insanity.
Right. The defense counsel was actually remarkably candid about this from the outset. They essentially told the court they were fighting only for Griffiths' life, not for his freedom, because the basic facts of the crime were undeniable, given the confession and the evidence. So their strategy required convincing the jury that Griffiths was mentally unstable enough at the time of the crime that he didn't fully grasp the fundamental criminality of his actions, even if he knew physically what he was doing.
To support this, the defense brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Alistair Robertson Grant. He testified that, in his opinion, Griffiths showed early signs of schizophrenia. He also noted that Griffiths' father had suffered from the same condition. So the argument presented was a classic defense of diminished responsibility. Yes, he had the intent to act, But perhaps his severe intoxication on the night, combined with this underlying mental vulnerability, meant he lacked the full criminal capacity to appreciate the true nature and consequences of his actions.
The prosecution swiftly countered this, though. They called Dr. F.H. Brisby, who was the medical officer from Walton Jail, the prison where Griffiths had been held since his arrest. Based on extensive observation over several weeks, Dr. Brisby testified unequivocally that Griffiths was perfectly sane, both during his time in prison awaiting trial and, in his professional opinion, at the time of the offense itself. In fact, there's an interesting side note. Apparently, after listening to Griffiths' own detailed testimony in court, where he calmly recounted the deliberate act of swinging the child into the wall, Dr. Grant, the defense psychiatrist, privately conceded that Griffiths likely was of sound mind, and the insanity defense was probably quite weak.
And the most powerful evidence presented in court, visually and scientifically, was that forensic display of the fingerprints. Inspector Colin Campbell, the very man who found the match back in August, meticulously presented these large, enlarged copies of the fingerprints to the judge and jury. He demonstrated, point by point, 16 separate matching ridge characteristics between the latent print lifted from the Winchester bottle and the print taken from Griffith's left hand.
And the identification of 16 matching points was absolutely crucial in 1948 British legal practice. It was considered the gold standard, the accepted threshold of proof for fingerprint analysis at the time. It was seen as virtually eliminating any possibility of error or some kind of accidental match. The confidence this hard scientific evidence gave the prosecution case was just enormous.
Yeah, and it's really important to note the complete lack of challenge from the defense on any of the physical evidence. The defense counsel didn't even attempt to cross-examine the forensic experts about the suit fibers or the type A blood match or the sock fibers found back in the hospital ward. The forensic facts were simply accepted as incontrovertible, overwhelming. There was no arguing with them.
So given the weight of the evidence, particularly the fingerprints and the confession, the jury's deliberation was famously brief, just 23 minutes. They returned a guilty verdict. Mr. Justice Oliver immediately donned the traditional black cap, stating clearly that he entirely agreed with their verdict. He described the crime as one of the most brutal ferocity, and then he delivered the mandatory sentence at the time, death.
Peter Griffiths lodged no appeal against the verdict or the sentence. He was hanged on November 19, 1948, just over 6 months after the murder at HM Prison, Liverpool. The executioner was Albert Pierpoint, who was the UK's most famous and prolific executioner at the time. Griffiths' stated hope back when he was charged, "I hope I get what I deserve," was, in the end, fulfilled.
But as we've really tried to emphasize throughout this, the lasting legacy of this case isn't just the solving of a horrific crime, but the extraordinary mechanism that was used to solve it. And the very foundation of that mechanism, the public trust that enabled the mass fingerprinting, had to be honored right to the very end.
And this brings us to that astonishing final action by the police force. Just weeks before Griffiths' execution was carried out, DCI Capstick and his superiors made good on their solemn promise to the people of Blackburn. All 46,253 fingerprint records that had been collected during that massive 3-month operation were gathered together. They were taken to a local paper mill.
And this wasn't done quietly. It was a deliberate, very public, mass pulping exercise. Journalists were specifically invited, and they were present to witness and document the destruction of every single one of those special fingerprint cards. This wasn't just, disposing of old paper. It was a profound public statement by the police. It proved, unequivocally, to the citizens of Blackburn that the police had kept their word, that the biometric data collected under the duress of this high-profile, deeply shocking case would not be secretly stored or used for any other purpose.
And that single action, the public destruction, it really cemented the ethical credibility of the whole operation, didn't it? It established mass screening as a viable, successful investigative tool in the UK, but crucially, only on the strict precondition that law enforcement respected the boundaries of privacy and civilian cooperation. Without the destruction of those 26,253 cards, you have to wonder if future requests for mass cooperation might have been met with widespread public refusal.
Absolutely. And today, the site of the old Queen's Park Hospital is now part of the modern Royal Blackburn Teaching Hospital. But the forensic achievement of 1948 remains one of the most remarkable instances of early large-scale criminal investigation. It perfectly demonstrated that effective administrative organization, the application of emerging technology like fingerprinting, and crucially, maintaining public trust, were all equally essential ingredients for.
So reflecting back on the murder of June Anne Devaney, the real importance of this case comes down to those two parallel realities, doesn't it? First, you have a truly barbaric crime that was solved using this groundbreaking, absolutely massive application of forensic science fingerprinting, which proved its viability as a major investigative tool. But second, and perhaps even more significantly, the entire mechanism relied completely on the cooperation of over 46,000 ordinary citizens. And that cooperation was entirely dependent on the police keeping that radical promise they made to destroy all the collected records afterwards.
Yeah, that trust factor is the really non-obvious but critical point here, I think. The administrative nightmare of manually checking nearly 50,000 sets of prints was only overcome because the political will was there, yes, but also because the public consent was there, freely given based on that promise. They made a conscious choice back then to prioritize the immediate needs of justice for this one horrific crime over the potential long-term intelligence gain of creating some kind of permanent national fingerprint database. And that choice, that specific ethical choice, absolutely paid off in solving the case.
Right. Now, for a final thought for you, our listeners, to perhaps mull over, we've discussed the very manual, paper-based nature of that 1948 investigation and the very physical, visible destruction of those records in a paper mill furnace. Today, of course, we live in a world where biometric data, things like DNA, facial recognition scans, digital fingerprints, it's all digital. It's instantaneously shareable across networks, and it's potentially permanently storable in vast remote cloud servers.
So the provocative thought is this. If a crime of similar shocking brutality happened today, and the police requested a similar kind of mass data collection, perhaps asking for voluntary DNA samples from everyone in a whole community, and they made the exact same promise they made in 1948. We guarantee we will delete every single digital record securely after this specific case is solved. End quote. The real question is, in our current digital age, would the public actually trust authorities who now possess vastly greater technological capabilities for permanent data retention and analysis to truly keep that promise? And maybe even more pointedly, in an age where digital data is seen as such a valuable intelligence asset, would authorities even be willing to make such a promise today? Would they be willing to sacrifice that immense potential intelligence asset for future cases? Or would the argument be made that the societal need for permanent data retention now outweighs the need for those kinds of temporary privacy guarantees that secured cooperation back in 1948? That contrast between the physical cards being publicly pulped in 1948 and the invisible, potentially permanent digital records of today, it really highlights how the very nature of trust, privacy, and state power has shifted in the digital age, doesn't it?
It certainly does, something worth thinking about. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into a landmark moment in forensic history and the enduring questions about public trust. We will be back soon with more insights.